Governor Mills announced today that Major General Douglas Farnham, Maine's Adjutant General and Commissioner of the Department of Defense, Veterans and Emergency Management, will retire after nearly 40 years.
Prior to his current role, Farnham served as commander of the 101st Air Refueling Wing in the Maine National Guard. Mills also announced she's nominating retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Diane Dunn to succeed Farnham.
Dunn is a former Assistant Adjutant General and Chief of Staff of the Maine Army National Guard with 33 years of distinguished military service and a career full of firsts. She's the first female to command a brigade in the Maine Army National Guard, and after her promotion to Brigadier General in 2020, she became the first female general officer in the 200-year history of the Maine Army National Guard.
If confirmed by the legislature, Dunn would be the first woman in history to lead the Maine National Guard and hold the post of commissioner.